Today we have a testimony of an LGBTQ person who shares their testimony. Please like and subscribe as it helps me to share more stories like this one. I never thought I'd be one to tell this kind of story, let alone live it. My life up until this point had been defined by a battle between who I felt I was and what society, and religion in particular, told me I should be. I've always known I was gay, and for most of my life, I rejected anything that suggested I was wrong for being myself. Religion was the loudest voice in that condemnation, so I turned my back on it entirely. I grew up in a religious household, but by the time I was in my 20s, I had abandoned those beliefs. My identity as a gay man became a core part of me, and I wore it proudly, especially because of the rejection I felt from my conservative upbringing. I surrounded myself with people who shared my values, who understood the complexities of being queer in a world that often felt hostile. For the longest time, I was at peace with my choices, until one fateful day changed everything. The event. It happened suddenly, with no warning. I was driving home after a night out with friends. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary. We had a few drinks, laughed, and shared stories about our lives. I was tired, but I didn't feel like I was in any real danger. But as I rounded a bend in the road, a truck veered into my lane. The crash happened before I even had time to react. Everything went black. For a while, I felt nothing at all. No pain, no fear, just emptiness. But then, a terrifying realization hit me. I wasn't dead, but I wasn't alive either. I was somewhere in between, floating in a void that felt both eternal and suffocating. And then, slowly, I began to descend. The descent. I can't describe exactly how it felt to fall through what seemed like layers of existence. It wasn't like anything I had ever experienced. The deeper I went, the colder and darker it became, until finally, I landed in a place that felt wrong on every level. I knew instantly where I was. Hell. This wasn't the cartoonish version of hell I had imagined in childhood, full of fire and brimstone. It was far worse. It was a place of despair, where every breath felt like an unbearable weight on my soul. The air was thick, and the cries of those around me echoed endlessly. What shocked me most was that I recognized some of the people there. They were like me, people who had embraced their LGBTQ identities, who had lived lives of pride and defiance. They were being punished, not for the choices they had made but for what those choices represented in the eyes of the beings that controlled this place. I saw people trapped in endless cycles of torment, reliving their worst moments over and over. Some were burned by invisible flames, while others were bound in chains, unable to move but fully aware of their suffering. I felt a deep, aching horror at the sight. These were people I had known in life, and their agony was unlike anything I had ever imagined. The encounter. Suddenly, I was no longer alone. A figure appeared before me, shadowy and menacing, yet undeniably powerful. It wasn't the devil, at least not the way I had been taught to imagine him. It was something worse, something ancient and filled with hatred. "You know why you're here," the figure hissed, its voice echoing inside my head. "I don't deserve this," I stammered, shaking with fear. "I've lived my life the way I thought was right. I never hurt anyone." "You think you know what's right," it said with a cold sneer. "You rejected the truth. You rejected salvation. You chose your path, and now you see where it leads." The weight of the words crushed me. I had spent so long fighting against the idea that who I was could be wrong, but here, in this place of suffering, I felt doubt creeping into my heart. Had I been wrong all along? Was I being punished for simply being myself? "I didn't ask to be this way," I pleaded. "I didn't choose this." The figure's gaze bore into me, as if it could see the deepest parts of my soul. "Every choice you made brought you here," it said. "You lived for yourself, for your desires, and now you see the consequences." The turning point. I was overwhelmed by a sense of hopelessness. I couldn't stay in this place, I couldn't. I fell to my knees, tears streaming down my face, and in that moment of complete vulnerability, something changed within me. For the first time in my life, I felt the presence of something greater than myself, a force I had spent years denying. It was faint, but it was there, a glimmer of light in the overwhelming darkness. "Please," I whispered, barely able to speak. "Please, save me. I don't want to be here." There was no immediate answer, but the suffocating presence of the figure seemed to lift slightly, as if something unseen was holding it back. I didn't understand what was happening, but I clung to that sliver of hope with everything I had. Waking up. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in hell. I was in a hospital bed, surrounded by beeping machines and sterile white walls. My body ached, and I felt disoriented, but I was alive. The doctors told me I had been unconscious for hours after the crash, and they weren't sure if I would make it. But here I was, against all odds, alive. I couldn't stop thinking about what I had experienced, about the visions of hell and the torment of those who had been like me. I had no doubt that it had been real. Conversion and transformation. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been given a second chance. The experience had shaken me to my core, and I knew I couldn't go back to living the way I had before. I had to make a change, and for the first time in years, I found myself drawn back to the faith I had rejected. It wasn't easy. My community, my friends, and even my own sense of identity felt at odds with what I now believed. But I couldn't ignore what I had seen. I started attending church again, slowly at first, unsure of how I would be received. To my surprise, I found comfort in the teachings of Christianity that I had once despised. The idea of redemption, of salvation, resonated with me in a way it never had before. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand why I was given this experience or why I was spared when so many others weren't. But I do know that I've been given a gift, a chance to change, to seek forgiveness, and to live a life that reflects the grace I was shown in my darkest moment. And so, I move forward, not without fear or uncertainty, but with faith. Faith that my life can be different, that I can be different, and that, in the end, I can find peace with the God I had so long rejected. The struggle with identity. The hardest part of my journey wasn't just accepting Christianity, it was coming to terms with what that acceptance meant for my identity. My life had been built around my sexuality, my pride in being who I was, and my defiance of anything that sought to suppress that. I had lived openly and without shame for so long that it felt like a betrayal to suddenly view my sexuality through the lens of sin, as something that needed redemption. I spent countless nights lying awake, trying to reconcile the man I had been with the man I now felt I was supposed to become. My friends noticed the change in me almost immediately. At first, they thought it was just trauma from the accident, but when I started talking about my experience in hell, the conversations became more strained. "How can you believe in that?" one of my closest friends asked me one night. "We've spent our whole lives fighting against people who think we're going to hell just for being ourselves. Now you're telling me you believe they were right?" Her words stung, but they weren't wrong. I felt the same internal conflict. Part of me wanted to scream that I wasn't turning my back on who I was, that I was simply responding to something greater than myself, but I couldn't deny that my newfound faith seemed to come with expectations that made me deeply uncomfortable. I started attending support groups for people who had similar experiences, people who had had near-death experiences or religious epiphanies that turned their lives upside down. Some of them were LGBTQ as well, and they, like me, were struggling to understand how their identities fit into their new faith. Hearing their stories was both comforting and terrifying. I wasn't alone, but I also wasn't the only one grappling with the fear that my very identity might be incompatible with my salvation. Facing rejection and loneliness. As my commitment to Christianity deepened, I faced rejection from both sides. My LGBTQ friends started distancing themselves from me. They couldn't understand how someone who had been so deeply involved in the community could now embrace a faith that, in their eyes, condemned them. I tried to explain that it wasn't about condemning anyone, it was about my personal experience, my need to seek redemption after what I had seen. But the words felt hollow, even to me. I couldn't escape the fact that Christianity had long been used as a weapon against people like me. At the same time, the Christian community I tried to join wasn't entirely welcoming either. Some of them were kind, accepting me as a new believer and encouraging me in my journey. But others were more hesitant, their eyes filled with suspicion when I told them my story. They didn't know what to make of a gay man who had suddenly turned to faith, and I could feel the judgment in their silence. The loneliness became overwhelming at times. I felt like I was caught between two worlds, neither of which fully accepted me. I was too Christian for my LGBTQ friends and too gay for the Christians. I questioned my faith constantly. Was this really the right path for me? Was I misunderstanding what God wanted from me? Or was I simply grasping at something to make sense of the terrifying experience I had gone through? The search for purpose. Despite the challenges, I couldn't shake the conviction that I had been given this second chance for a reason. I began to pour myself into the Bible, seeking answers to the questions that tormented me. The words felt foreign at first, like an ancient language I didn't fully understand, but slowly, they began to resonate with me. I found comfort in passages about grace, about forgiveness, and about the idea that no one was beyond redemption. But then I would come across verses that spoke of sin and judgment, and I would feel that familiar sense of guilt and shame creep back in. I didn't know what to do with those feelings. How could I live in a way that honored God without denying a core part of who I was? Was I supposed to suppress my sexuality entirely? Was I being called to celibacy? Or was there another way, a path that allowed me to embrace both my faith and my identity? I sought out pastors and religious leaders for guidance, but the answers they gave me were often unsatisfying. Some told me that I needed to renounce my sexuality altogether, that being gay was incompatible with being a true Christian. Others were more compassionate, suggesting that God's grace covered all things, but they couldn't tell me what that meant for my day-to-day life. I felt like I was stumbling in the dark, searching for a purpose that eluded me. The only thing I knew for certain was that I couldn't go back to the life I had lived before. The memory of hell haunted me, reminding me that there were consequences to the choices we made in this life. But what those consequences meant for someone like me, I still didn't fully understand. Finding a community. It was during one of my lowest moments, when I was considering abandoning faith altogether, that I stumbled upon a small, progressive church that openly welcomed LGBTQ people. It was unlike any church I had ever been to. The people there spoke openly about their struggles, about how they had found a way to reconcile their faith with their identities. They didn't shy away from the hard questions, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I didn't have to hide any part of myself. The pastor, a soft-spoken woman in her 40s, took me aside after one of the services and asked if I wanted to talk. I poured out my story to her, from the near-death experience to the visions of hell, and my ongoing struggle to understand what God wanted from me. She listened without judgment, and when I was done, she simply said, "God doesn't make mistakes. You are who you are for a reason, and that includes your sexuality." Her words hit me like a revelation. I had spent so long feeling like I had to choose between my faith and my identity, but here was someone telling me that maybe I didn't have to. She explained that faith wasn't about following a strict set of rules, it was about love, grace, and the pursuit of a relationship with God. And that relationship was personal. It didn't look the same for everyone.